I wasn't aware of what things were happening in my head. I didn't know what it meant. And I was having intrusive thoughts left and right to the point where at the age of 10, I didn't want to eat out. I didn't want to go to restaurants. I just all of a sudden had these fears of getting food poisoning and getting sick. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Please Excuse My OCD. My name is Tyler Falcoa, and I'm your host. This is Banja, and she left, but she may be popping in and out of the podcast here because she's my cat and she does whatever she wants. Please Excuse My OCD is a podcast that I started to really shed some light on OCD from the perspective of someone who has had it his whole life. I'm 29 years old. I've had OCD forever. I was formally diagnosed at the age of 10. I've been dealing with OCD my whole life, so I don't really know. I know a little bit about my life prior to when it really struck me. I've been able to form lots of tools and experience and stories about my OCD that I feel can be valuable to people who have OCD and never really knew where to turn to or who to turn to. This can also be valuable for people who know somebody or love somebody with OCD, somebody that is newly diagnosed, someone who's had it for a long time and maybe never necessarily knew that they actually had it or wanted to admit that they have it. This podcast is to shed some light on OCD with empathy, positivity, and just a pinch of humor. I've learned to deal with things with humor. That's something that helps me because OCD, anything that's related to mental health can be extremely scary, nerve-wracking, debilitating. Sometimes the way that I deal with things is straight up humor because it lightens it up a little bit. It softens it up for me. Sometimes when things feel so serious and they sometimes can be very serious, that itself can make it worse, especially for someone with OCD. So my mission here is to break down the stigma that surrounds OCD. It can be terrifying to talk about. It can be terrifying to talk about our thoughts, and our intrusive thoughts are terrifying to talk about in general. And I'm trying to make that a little bit easier. I also want to build a tight-knit community that supports one another. That could be on Discord, Instagram, TikTok, because that's what we need. We need more empathy. We need more people to talk about it. It doesn't necessarily get rid of OCD, but I think it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Without further ado, my name is Tyler Falcoa, and this is Please Excuse My OCD. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. I am simply someone who has had OCD for most of his life, and I'm here to share my experience, my firsthand experience with OCD. As always, if you are struggling, please reach out to someone in the professional medical field. So I kind of introduced myself in that intro. I'm 29 years old. I'm from Rhode Island. And growing up, I felt like everyone was like me. I felt like the things that I was thinking about, the things that I was doing, acting out my compulsions at a very young age, I felt like maybe other people do this. And it actually wasn't until I started to talk about it where I realized, oh, this is not something that people do normally. One of my first experiences with OCD was probably at the age of 6 or 7, I would say. I was in first grade. And, we used to have calisthenics in the morning, get our bodies warmed up and pumped up before we go and sit down for 6 hours and, color. But we were doing jumping jacks, and one of my friends whispered to me, just randomly, fuck. Like I distinctly remember the first time I heard fuck. And that was it. And I was just like, oh, okay. And so I went to my parents that weekend. We were in the car. We were coming back from Walmart, and it was a Sunday afternoon. And I said, Dad, what's fuck mean? And yeah, my dad was very angry, of course. I mean, when you hear your first grade child being like, what's fuck? It can be kind of like a sobering kind of toe in the cold water. I'm sure for a parent, I'm not a parent, I can't tell you, but I can tell you what my reaction was. So seeing his reaction scared the shit out of me. My dad, really hardworking, loves his family, will do anything for everybody and anybody. Really just wanted the best for us, of course, just like any parent, right? His reaction was, what? Where'd you hear that? Don't ever say that again. So my dad being, he was also a police officer. So I had this thought in my head where if I kept saying fuck, then I would somehow go to jail. I'm not sure where it came from. It was probably just an intrusive thought, and I believed it at 6, 7 years old. But I couldn't not say fuck in my head. It was just constant. It's like if I tell you to not listen or not if I tell you to not think of a pink elephant, the first thing you're going to do is think of a pink elephant. But I couldn't let it go. I could not let go of fuck. And knowing that fuck was a bad word and not knowing the consequences of said word, fuck, I was losing my shit. So I had come up with a song in my head that would comfort me. That was sort of my compulsion. Anytime the word fuck would come up, and I had this debilitating fear that I would go to jail and everybody in my family would never love me again, I had to sing this song. And it was, policemen go to Disney, they are great. I don't know what it was, but I remember being that age and starting to have this way of dealing with these thoughts. And I must have sang that song in my head. I obviously was not present the rest of the day. I remember singing that in my head towards bedtime. And we had this discussion about fuck, probably early afternoon. And that song followed me and stuck with me, and I would, say it and use it and sing it in my head all day long for a long time. Until, of course, I got older and I became an avid swearer, because that's just, sometimes it's just fun to say fuck. I think that was one of my first instances of actually recognizing that, or not even recognizing, just looking back, it's probably one of my first intrusive thoughts and first compulsions was probably when I was that age. My parents always said that I, was extremely anal about where things went. And that's not necessarily OCD, but it can be an OCD tendency. Just because you're neat and organized does not make you OCD. And that's a big misconception. But even at, 2, 3, 4 years old, I was extremely anal about where things went, especially my shoes. I was obsessed with shoes. I had a certain way of putting shoes away and putting them back and making them look a certain way and cleaning them. So I think it was always there. Then at the age of 10, you guys can't see it, but I have a scar on my left arm. And I played football, for the Pee-wees here in my hometown. And I got tackled in a scrimmage with my own team by one of my teammates who had a habit of tackling with his head down. And if you have played football, if you know anybody who played football, if you love watching football, you're not supposed to tackle with your head down like this. You want to be able to see the person you're tackling. And so at the time we had metal clips, chin strap clips. And my teammate tackled me with his head down, and the clip got right under my skin all the way down to the tissue of my arm. 10 years old, my arm is wide open, like a nice fat chunk of meat is like, we didn't know it at the time, but it was rolled inside my arm. That broke everything free in my head, in my being. I went to the hospital. I got 115 stitches. That began the road of my OCD journey. That was the beginning of my OCD journey, for sure. I went to therapy for the first time after that, and I learned a lot about my separation anxiety between my parents and I. I learned the fact that I had OCD in the first place, that I had PTSD, that I had generalized anxiety disorder. OCD really is the peak of anxiety. That's after panic. You know, it's a way for your brain to try to control things. And because I had no control at that age, I wasn't aware of what things were happening in my head. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how to deal with any of them. They just ran free. And I was having intrusive thoughts left and right to the point where at the age of 10, I didn't want to eat out. I didn't want to go to restaurants. I just all of a sudden had these fears of getting food poisoning and getting sick no matter where I went. Even with friends, if my parents weren't there, I'd be scared shitless that something would happen because they weren't there. And to shed some light on that, my parents are so extremely hardworking people, and they were both in the middle of trying to work and also go to my brother's practice, which was a couple fields down, and mine at the same time, going back and forth after work. And at the time that I got hurt, my parents were at my brother's practice before coming to mine. And so because my parents weren't there, and I'm a 10-year-old with his arm basically hanging open, that was, to my brain, it was like, oh my God, my parents aren't here. Something bad happened. So after that, you know, anytime my parents weren't there, in my head, something bad was going to happen. And so it really manifested itself in ways that I was never aware of until I got older. You know, if I don't touch the light switch 5 times, you know, something bad's going to happen. Something's going to kill me, or something's going to kill my parents. Or, you know, if I go to my friend's sleepover and my parents aren't there, something bad's going to happen. And, you know, I'm never going to be able to see my family again. And just to have these thoughts at 10 years old are terrifying. And I didn't really necessarily know that they were OCD. I didn't necessarily know that other people didn't think like this. You know, I kind of just felt like this is just the way it is. And I was always an anxious person, so even before I got hurt, I had intrusive thoughts, but this was like out of proportion. Fast forward a couple months after I started therapy, on Valentine's night, my mom parked the car in the garage after work, and we didn't know this at the time, but we live near woods, and so we used to keep some like extra storage of dry dog food in the garage. So the rats were actually coming into the garage, getting into the dog food and storing it inside the engine of the cars because it was warm. So there was a gas leak and caused the house to go up in flames. And whenever people tell you, you know, whenever people are like, oh, like stop, drop, and roll, or, you know, go to the furthest side of the house, or, you know, crawl on your arms and knee, like all of that goes completely out of the window when you're in a time of crisis like that. Unless you rehearse it like every day, you don't know what to do. So 10 years old, once again, my brother's 8. My parents come home. There's like an atrocious smell within a few minutes of my mom coming home. And we checked everywhere. We actually took the oven out of where it was to try to see if there was anything underneath or behind, take the fridge out, see if there's anything behind the fridge, go downstairs in the basement, go upstairs, nothing. And then at the time there was like a breezeway between the kitchen and the garage. And so my dad went in the breezeway, opened the door, and then flames just fumbled in to the house. He closed the door quickly. He's like, let's get the fuck out of here. You know, my dad, let's get the fuck out of here, New England. And there was a door in the breezeway that we could have easily gone out of. We could have gone out of the door on the other side of the house. We didn't know which one to go to. Like when I tell you there was a door 3 feet from us and there was a door 25 feet from us, we didn't know where to go. We ended up going out the closest door, and the closest door was also the closest to the actual flames. And by the time we got in front of the house, by the time we actually looked at the garage, the whole door was already melted away and the flames were already engulfing the whole garage. So we obviously, panic, shaking. We didn't know whose house to go into. We ran across the street we see our neighbors looking, our other neighbors are looking on the side of them. We, for some reason, went into one of the cars at the bottom of the driveway, which we got in there. And I remember me, my mom, and my brother looking at each other, bawling and just being like, what do we do? What are we doing in here? And my dad, of course, my dad being a police officer, he had everybody, police and fire on the line to get down here. And eventually we got into my neighbor's house across the street. They put us into a bedroom and just calmed us down, stopped us from watching the fire. And so me being 10 years old, just newly diagnosed with OCD or formally diagnosed with OCD, I didn't realize how this was going to affect me until years later. To give this a little bit of backstory, the night before this happened, I used to hate going to bed. And we were watching I think it was like a Pro Bowl. There was a Pro Bowl happening. I loved watching football with my dad. And so we're watching the Pro Bowl and my mom says, go to bed. It's time for bed. And I remember saying to her, I don't want to go to bed. I hate this bed. I hate this house. Went to bed. And the next day, Valentine's Day, the house goes up in flames. So for somebody who's already dealing with OCD and trying to deal with intrusive thoughts and this magical thinking of if this doesn't happen, if I don't do this, X is going to happen, to subconsciously in my brain know that I said, I hate this house, I hate this bed, and then the next day the house burns down. That's some heavy shit. That's some heavy shit. And that made things 10 times worse. And that was my first instance of actually recognizing my derealization that I was having. I remember we were living in a mobile home on the front lawn as they were, fixing the house for the next year. And I remember looking to my mom at one day and I said, Mom, I feel like I'm not real. I don't feel like I'm here. And my mom, of course, she didn't know. She didn't know what that was about. And she said, oh, it's probably, you're probably tired. And I felt like that when I got hurt. It was like an out of body experience when I looked at my arm and it was wide open. These were all little things that I was experiencing that later on became extremely pivotal in understanding and recognizing my OCD and how to deal with it. So turning 10 was a big year for me. I've been going to therapy since then. I go every 2 weeks now just to keep myself in check. I believe that if you go to the gym every week, you should be going to a therapist because you keep your body in shape. It's just as important to keep your mind in shape. But this led me on a road to really dealing with OCD. I didn't get put onto medication until I was 19 years old. My first year in college, I was a mess, an absolute mess. I was having panic attacks for the first time in years. I was extremely, extremely beside myself. Derealization was my best friend at the time. That's when I first started medication. So I had gone a whole decade without medication with full-blown OCD, not knowing how to deal with it. And learning how to deal with it, but not in the way that I do today. I didn't get into meditation until I was in my early 20s. I didn't understand the mechanism of what was happening in my brain until I had this, I call it a nervous breakdown. It really felt like a nervous breakdown. I don't know necessarily what it would be categorized as, but I know my OCD was in full swing. I was having thoughts I've never had before. I was having suicidal thoughts. I did not know. I remember there's a hospital in Rhode Island that I was trying to get into to get evaluated and hopefully taken in because I felt like I couldn't trust myself. And I remember them basically, after questioning me and really getting to know what it is that I need, they're like, all right, well, we'll see you next week. With, I'm not going to say his name. We'll see you next week and you're going to see so-and-so. And I remember leaving that place absolutely terrified, being like, what if I do something to myself? Or what if I do something to someone else? Like, I can't be trusted. Like I need to be taken in now. Looking back, I'm glad that I didn't make a scene and say, take me now. Like, I'm glad that I went home and dealt with it as hard as it was, because I started to learn to trust myself, really trust myself. Nobody teaches you how to trust yourself. Nobody teaches you how to know yourself. You've got to go out of the way to read about what it is that needs to be asked. How do you dive deeper? How do you face your fear? How do you go home when you are terrified of yourself and learn to deal with that? This is my early 20s and I'm trying to figure it out. And at this point, I was going to therapy twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, between my therapist at school and this new outpatient program at the hospital that I was going to. So there's so much to this. My story is extremely long, but now that I'm 29 years old, I own a few businesses. I have incredible, incredible people in my life, my family, my friends. I still deal with OCD on a daily basis. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Like, if you've ever watched The Mandalorian, he ends up getting like plated armor every time he comes back with the job finished. And that's kind of how I feel at 29 years old, where I have all this armor that I've been able to acquire dealing with OCD, panic attacks, depression, anxiety, and I wear it and I use it to defend myself. I use it to defend myself against OCD, against myself sometimes. That took a lot of work. That took so much work, so much patience, and half the time there is no patience to deal with it because it is absolutely fucking terrifying. But I am living proof that OCD can be dealt with. OCD can be talked about. OCD can be used as a strength to do the things that you want in this world. And I look at everything with a positive and negative lens. If I can look at something with a negative lens, I can absolutely look at it with a positive lens. And if I can look at it with a positive lens, I can 1000% look at it with a negative lens too. I believe there is a positive and negative to every single aspect of life and every single person. And so while OCD can be very negative and debilitating and terrifying, it can also be a positive thing if you can use it in the positive ways, if you can find a strength somewhere in there. I believe that I've found my strengths through dealing with OCD. I can talk about it. I can talk to anybody about anything. And I can talk to you. I can talk to you about it. And hopefully it sheds some light on something that you're experiencing, something that you have experienced, maybe something that someone you love has experienced. That to me is why I created this podcast. It may not be a super family-friendly podcast at times. I'm not going to be the doctor here spitting facts back to you. I'm going to tell you how it is, how it was, and how it's been for me with OCD. And I'm going to deal with it the way that I've dealt with it. That's with positivity. It's with humor. It's with the facts too, yes. But this is something different. This is not something that I want to make you feel more scared of. I want you to use it. Use it to the best of your ability to become a strength on some level. Use it to help other people. Because there's a lot that can come out of struggle. And I believe that because I've dealt with it. This is why I'm here. And this is why you're here. You want to learn a little bit more about OCD. You want to connect. You want to connect to somebody. You want to share something about yourself that you see in this podcast with other people too, so that they can understand what you're dealing with. That's half of the battle with OCD is we want to be heard. We want to be understood. And I'll go more into my story as we go. And as I get to know you and you get to know me here on this podcast, you'll learn a lot more about who I am and why I think the way I do. And I want to hear from you. I want you to comment here. I want you to share this with someone and let me know what they think. I want to know what you think. I want you to message me on Instagram. Please excuse my OCD. Message me there. Message me on TikTok. Message me on Facebook. Go on my website. I want to talk. So, I got a really positive intrusive thought. I wouldn't call this an intrusive thought. I would call this more like an inspiration from the divine, right? When you just get a thought and you know. Different than an intrusive thought. I was up early one day and I was listening to, I love Arnold's podcast, The Pump Club. Arnold's Pump Club, he pumps me up every morning. Love it. I was listening to Arnold one morning and it just hit me. I need to start a podcast about OCD because I know so much about OCD through my experience and I feel like this could help so many people. Please excuse my OCD, just boom, right into my head. And it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek title. Like, oh, like with OCD, we want it to be quiet. We don't want to make it loud for other people. I don't want them to know I have OCD. What if this happens while I'm at the party? Fuck that. It's kind of like, oh, please excuse my OCD. Like, no, this is loud. This is a loud podcast. You can be loud sometimes. It's okay. It's okay to be loud. It's okay to let people know that you're struggling with something. As hard as it is, it's okay. You don't have to minimize yourself. You don't have to hide yourself. You don't have to hide what you're struggling. Okay? Please excuse my OCD was a lyric that I had in a song that I threw away. I didn't put the song out. I love music. I am a producer. I write music for other people and for myself. And one of the songs that I wrote for myself had the line, please excuse my OCD, in the beginning of the song. And I'd never used it. Here we are. It's the title of my podcast because we don't need to be excused. You don't need to be excused. You need to be heard and understood, but you don't need to be excused. So I think that's a point that I want to drive home with this podcast. Please, I'd love to connect with you. You can follow here on wherever you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast. Please give us a follow, comment, share this with someone who you think might benefit with it or benefit from it. And follow us on social media at Please Excuse My OCD or visit our website, pleaseexcusemyocd.com to check out merch or sign up for our free newsletter, which I'll be sending out every week to talk about bullet points, talk more deeply about things that I find interesting with OCD and that you might find helpful. And as well as I'm going to be answering questions at the end of every episode. So I want to hear from you. You can message me on Instagram at Please Excuse My OCD. You can also message us on Facebook, same thing there. But you can also submit a question on the website. So you just ask a question on the website and I'll be reading them and going through them at the end of each episode. We'll be on every Monday. So I'll see you next Monday. Thanks for tuning in.